Right, Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in the jihadi organisation.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. But in reality, what we really do, we look at geopolitics in the round. So that's from the macro to the micro. And frankly, the truth of the matter is that it's the micro that often affects your life more than the macro in many places. But you need to understand both aspects. So today what I've got is an absolutely fantastic guest, because what I've wanted to do for some time is to once again look at policing in the United Kingdom and look at what it really means for the public and how and if that is actually the best that we can do. You know, are we as good as our compatriots in other parts of the world? Are we better? You know, so this is the question. So what I want to do is introduce you to a senior mid-ranking officer. And by that, what I mean is to understand that the police is an inverted pyramid. Or, you know, if you looked at where the power sits for most people at constable level. Then you jump to, which is around about 6% of the police service. Then you jump to sergeants, and they're about over 15%, let's say 75%. And then it's inspectors, chief inspectors, etc., and you go on. But they're actually quite a small number of individuals. So at a senior level, some people call them officer level. When you get to an inspector, it's an officer level. That's a misnomer, by the way, so I should explain before we go any further, is that actually the power in the police actually sits in the constable. Because in order to do anything, you have to oftentimes be a constable. So the law says a constable may, a constable shall, a constable must, whatever it might be. And very few actually say an inspector can oversee or a chief superintendent can oversee. So really the power of arrest, etc., lies in the power of the constable. Hence that I say to you that it's a kind of an inverted pyramid, because the basic work, most of the work, is done by constables. So anyway, with that in mind, let's move on. May I introduce you? In fact, no, I'm going to let him introduce himself. Please do, my good guest.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Phil. I'm a retired police officer from one of the Northern Forces. I joined in 1986, retired as an officer in 2016 after having done 30 years at various ranks from constable, sergeant to inspector. And then since 2016 up until 2 years ago, I worked in various roles still within policing as a civilian in investigations and misconduct, etc. A very brief overview of my career. I started as a young PC back in 86. I was on patrol, I was a tutor constable, I worked in CID, I worked in various crime sort of related squads. I got promoted, I was a patrol sergeant, I was a custody sergeant for a few years, and then I was a sergeant in charge of various tasking teams where we dealt with public order matters, crime matters. Got myself promoted again to inspector, various roles there, again a tasking team type situation which was dedicated to various problems, a bit like a troubleshooting squad. They brought my team in whenever they needed help in various areas. I was a partnerships inspector, so I've seen the perspective of dealing with outside agencies. I've been a patrol inspector, response, I've done neighbourhoods. So yeah, I've done quite a varied I've had quite a varied career, should I say, and throughout that, all three ranks, I was also a member of a police support unit, which in layman's terms people call them the riot team. I've done that at all three ranks as an add-on to my sort of day job, if you like. And then after I retired, I was a civilian, I was in our vetting team, I was in the investigations team dealing with vulnerable people, sexual offences, child offences, and then most recently I had a few years in our professional standards team dealing with misconduct hearings. So that's a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of me and my background.
A potted history of your work. Brilliant, Phil. Can I ask you about, first of all, I do want to jump onto one issue, and that's the vetting aspect, because I think people misunderstand the vetting. And the reason why I'm asking you that is because we've recently had this spate of incidents where people suggest that the police are not vetting people who come in. So can you just explain how, for example, Wayne Couzens could be brought into the police, an ex-soldier, could be brought into the police, and what would the vetting be for that role?
Well, I can only speak as to what the vetting process was when I was in that department. Whether there have been changes or not in light of recent events, I don't know. But one thing that I think the public sort of expects us to have in the vetting team is a crystal ball. Now, we cannot have a crystal ball and say, I think in 10 years' time, this officer is going to go and commit these serious offences. It happens, it has happened, but the problem is we can only go on what we have recorded on various systems. And when we do the vetting, there's obvious things like criminal records checks, there's history of whether someone's been arrested, we do social media checks to look at people's viewpoints. Obviously, if we've got people that are affiliated with far right or terrorist sympathisers, that's a big red flag and that's a no-no. But it's only possible to look at what we've got on our systems. I think people expect us to have in-depth psychiatric analysis, and that's just not something that's happened. And I don't see how it's plausible really to have lengthy psychiatric analysis of every potential recruit. I think in the main, the vetting, how we've had it, has worked, because thankfully the incidents such as Wayne Couzens are very, very, very rare. Don't get me wrong, one is too many, but I think to be able to foresee that and prevent that, it's very difficult, nigh on impossible.
I mean, let me put some context around that. If you look at, example, the medical profession, I did a show on that. For listeners who regularly listen will understand that we did two or three podcasts on the medical profession, looking at various incidents. And there was up to about 1,000 people who'd been murdered. I'm not talking about no accidents. I'm not talking about, where the surgeon makes a mistake and somebody dies. Even where somebody dies because the surgeon wasn't particularly good. I'm talking about actual murders of people in the NHS have committed murder, and an associate to the NHS, so GPs. Obviously the most famous being the chap from Manchester, who killed about 500 odd people. So, frankly, many professions have problems. They're just not as articulated as police problems are. Because Couzens is one individual, and I've said to you there's 1,000. I mean, when I looked at the medical aspect, I think the lowest figure of people who were being put forward as being negative for the profession, who had murdered people, was about 4. So let's contextualise that. Nobody says, I'm not going to go to the NHS and I can't trust him. Right? So let's put it in context. But I think it's something that we don't do with police, and that's put things in context. So I want to hit more onto that. The other aspect that I'll say is in terms of, you mentioned in vetting, in terms of whether you've had a criminal record or not. Well, again, I did another show and we looked at Parliament, and it was something like 62% of parliamentarians had some type of criminal record. Okay? So once again, context is the thing. Now, you did mention that for the vast majority of officers, you can't, look into everything. Now, there is a system that does that's called developed vetting, and we do that. And, if you're in different roles, the role that I was in, for example, which is looking at the political arena, we were vetted every 5 years in terms of developed vetting to allow us access to top secret material. And that's a very, very long drawn out process. You could never do that for every officer. It's just impossible. So what you say is correct. You do a great job with the limited capacity that one has in order to vet everybody coming into the service. And I think that's important. And the reason I've only mentioned that is because just the other day, somebody was on television suggesting that police weren't vetting people properly. So I want to take this opportunity to look at where all of the often ill-informed ideas are about how the police work. Now, the other thing that you said was that you came up in the 80s and you came up in a force in the north. Do you, or can you tell me whether you believe there's a difference between a northern force, and the vast majority of northern forces, but for Greater Manchester, around about the 3,000 officer, 4,000 officer mark? Greater Manchester, I think, is 10, which is the second biggest in the country, and the Met's 33,000. So you can see the big difference. And I'm just talking police officers now, I'm not talking about police staff. So if you're just talking officers, you can see the big difference between that. My question is, do you think that a smaller force is better? Do you think you've got a better handle on people in a smaller force? Or do you think that, and the reason why I ask this is because obviously they're talking about amalgamation of forces coming up soon. Do you think that in amalgamating forces, it will lessen the opportunities to manage?
That's an interesting question, and I think it shouldn't do, because for every constable, you should have the same ratio of sergeants, inspectors to constable, no matter what size of the force. Obviously, the Met has far more constables, then in turn they have more sergeants, more inspectors, and so on. What they do have, they only have one chief officer for 33,000 people, whereas in my force there was one chief officer for just over 3,000 officers. Having said that, the way the Met is structured, it has a far bigger command team in terms of assistant commissioners, deputy commissioners, etc. So there is a bigger command team, and they all have individual areas of responsibility. So I suppose it shouldn't make a difference, but then it might do. And I suppose there are good and bad things to big and small forces. The larger forces, they have far more resources, they have bigger budgets, but then again, with the amount of things that they have to deal with and the amount of officers, those budgets can easily get swallowed up. In a smaller force, we probably have less incidents to deal with. We don't have up in the north the things that the Met had in terms of all the diplomatic protection, it being a capital city and all the problems that a capital city attracts. Having said that, we weren't geared up to deal with it. So I suppose my view is that it shouldn't make a difference, but in reality it will. And I know amalgamation of forces was spoken about many, many years ago when I was a fairly young officer. And I think most forces, most chief constables were certainly against it. I mean, the chief constables would be against it because a lot of them would stand to lose their position. If there's 10 chief constables rather than 43, they're going to lose it. And also, senior officers approaching deputy chief, assistant chief sort of level, they're looking at things saying the chances for development are going to be reduced. So I think if you ask senior officers, a lot of those might share the view that we're better off staying as we are. If you ask the politicians, they may think it's better to amalgamate them because there stands to be savings there.
Yeah, that's what Labour's come out with.
And I think the way that things are going, like Carlton said, I started off in the 80s. From my memory, budgets was something that were never talked about. If you needed to work overtime because you were dealing with an incident, you just did it and it was not questioned. Later in my service, overtime became a big thing, it became restricted, and you had to have everything authorised before you did it. So in short, budgets became a bigger and bigger and bigger factor of policing, and it almost got to the point where you felt it was being run like a business rather than a service, and balancing the books was a big factor.
Yeah, and that's something you had to deal with as well as the inspector, because that role came to you, didn't it?
Yeah.
The balancing of the money. You know, what can I do? How many officers can I have here? What will they cost me? You know, that was all down to you. So it changed the role of inspector.
Yeah.
You agree? Yeah. The other thing that I want you to look at, as you were just saying what you were saying, which I thought was great about the force sizes, and for sure, Labour said they're bringing it in 2027. They're trying to bring in amalgamation of forces. The other thing that I was looking at, there's economies of scale for one, obviously, because everybody's got their own little system, and now that system will go. But I'm guessing that maybe there's a belief in the esprit de corps of a particular force. Is that the case?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, in what
In terms
context do
of
you mean by
in terms
that?
of if you're in, let's say, Cleveland Police, maybe you think, I'm a Cleveland police officer. Yeah, we are the best, and the esprit de corps is for you and your men and women in that force. Against, let's say, somebody in Derbyshire or in Kent or somewhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That you feel you better, and maybe there's a driver for you to perform better. But maybe there isn't. Maybe there's just nepotism. I don't know.
Yeah.
Whatever. I put that to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I suppose you could have that. You could have people saying in a small force that it's primarily men and women from that region, and there's some pride in looking after your local community and being the best. I suppose if you, for example, where I worked up in Yorkshire, if Yorkshire, all the three different Yorkshire forces and Humberside and maybe some of the North East forces were to all become one, would you lose some of that sense of local identity? A bigger force on promotion, etc., you might then be moved from, I don't know, Leeds up to Newcastle, and you might not know how Newcastle works despite it being in the same force. There's also a risk that each region in a force could still almost behave like its own force because that's what they've been used to doing. You're not going to overnight change all the staff in each area, so all your big cities in one of the potential larger forces would still probably be run by the same people and have the same people in there. So to get people to change their mindset and how they work is going to be a long process. So you would still in effect have Newcastle almost being like a different force to Leeds, even though they would potentially be the same.
So would you think that do you think there would be an opportunity to keep the best of each force, and maybe pass that working practice to the others as well, the best of each? I mean, I guess who decides what's best?
Yeah,
a factor.
that's the point. Hopefully it's a good idea to share best practice, because South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, Cumbria, Northumbria all have good things they can bring to the table. And in an ideal world, it would be an open discussion between all the senior officers saying, right, this is our best practice, that's yours, let's share best practice, let's amalgamate it. But personalities play a big part in this, and there might be some people that say, well, no, I don't want you taking credit for this because this is my idea, so I'm going to keep it still local to me. I think, apart from the obvious budget savings, which is a big driver for the politicians, there's a lot of things to be ironed out when you're going from 4 to 3 forces to, I mean, I don't know what...
I think it's probably about 10, I think,
about
as well.
10. So you're looking at increasing some of the forces substantially and merging them, and there'll be a bit of a potential... bit of a fight between senior officers as to who retains the power.
So now we come to the other question now of leadership.
Yeah.
Because this would demand leadership capacity. And the Met definitely has gone down this route of hiring people in at inspector level and hiring people in at, I think it's chief superintendent level. For those of you who don't know the ranks, these are the ranks which basically an inspector runs, if you will. If you're looking at a regular police station, it will run the shift, and then the chief superintendent or superintendent, depending on how big the place is, would run the police station. You know, so these are the senior ranks. Now, the problem with it is if you're bringing people directly into a police service without any knowledge other than running Tesco's or running, I don't know, let's just not put it on a mercantile situation. Let's say they were running a company that dealt with house building, whatever, you know, and they seem to have what it takes to run individuals. Can they perform the police role without any previous knowledge? What's your thoughts on that?
My personal view, and maybe this is because I'm more old school, that I'm not a fan of direct entry at either rank, and I shall tell you why. Like just been alluded to, an inspector, you run the frontline teams. You're the sort of most senior officer that's sort of boots on the ground. And what enabled me to do my job as an inspector on the front line, as a public order team inspector of various roles, was the fact that I'd had many years experience of doing that role as a PC and then as a sergeant. I think to bring someone in who's not got any previous policing experience as a frontline inspector managing a frontline policing team, I think it's fraught with danger. For one, you haven't got the experience to draw upon to enable you to make those decisions. You can't sit back and make decisions like you can in some jobs by having meetings about things and having lots of time. You've got to make that decision in a split second. And that comes from experience, not from what you can read in a book, not from passing an exam, and I don't think either from experience in other areas. Likewise, you've got the direct entry at superintendent. The argument that's been made to me by some people is that we have good people out in business who can run businesses. They're very good at finance, very good at HR. My view is hire them as senior HR and finance managers and pay them a decent wage. But to bring them in as a superintendent, and particularly at that rank, if you are operational, you will be goal commander for football matches, public order, firearms incident, and in my opinion, none of which have you got the experience to deal with. And lastly, and this applies to both direct entry ranks, personally I think you will have a serious lack of credibility with your staff. I class myself as a good leader. I was popular with my staff and I had credibility because they knew I'd been there and I'd done it and done everything I was asking them to do, and I still would go out and do it with them and demonstrate that. Somebody who's been brought in direct wouldn't have that credibility in my opinion. So in short, not a fan at all of direct entry.
So the way a lot of forces have tried to get around that though is basically by saying, okay, this officer's got high potential. We'll fast track this officer through the ranks and we'll make them a senior manager. And effectively what happens is with this fast track, and I know because I was on it, or was said to should have been on it, said to have been on it, effectively the way they wanted to run this thing was by saying, don't do the work, actually go into areas that talk about the overall statistics, overall logistics, overall progression, overall supply, overall management of a police service or force, if you want to use that terminology. So therefore what you would get is you get a situation whereby if you were picked up very early and somebody said, this person's got what we need, you could theoretically not do a day on the street. No, lie. Okay, you'd have to do your 2 years probation. But after your 2 years probation, you could basically keep your nose clean by going into, in the Met's case, the Commissioner's office, going into whatever it might be that allows you to have that overview from a strategic perspective, but without any tactical knowledge. So that in itself is a bad system, and I think it shows itself right now with the senior management that we now have, because I think a lot of the senior management have, for want of a better phrase, have never seen an angry man. So do you think that this bringing them in at this higher ranking levels stops that pretense of what I just said and actually then basically says, okay, so these guys have come in or these gals have come in at this level and that's what they are? Do you think that?
I can see the point in where you compare the two systems. I think the direct entry scheme is a lot different than the fast track. For example, the fast track, you will have had at least your basic 2 years probationary period learning the trade of being a police officer. And then if you're on the fast track or the high potential development scheme, whichever name it's given, you will then go from department to department for brief periods and have an overview of what they do. The advantage in that over the direct entry is you will still have had, albeit brief, some immersion in the various aspects of policing. And even if you're not doing it directly, you're working with people who are doing it directly. You've got the opportunity to speak to people, the opportunity to learn from people and have a better overall understanding of policing than somebody who just comes in from an outside company and said, right, you're the superintendent, you're running this police station and you're on firearms cover this evening. I think that's too much of a change.
Yeah, agreed. Now, just on the last one then, that I know from Germany when I worked there, prior to coming to the United Kingdom, they had a system whereby you went either into uniform or you went into CID. Now, the way they looked at it, they put a particular weight on CID in terms of everybody who joined into the CID was a commissar, which is basically an inspector, but it's not. It's different. But basically, if you were to just take the rank, you'd say it's an inspector. Whereas anybody who came into uniform went through as a constable, sergeant, through the ranks like that. But they were separate forces. They were effectively separate forces, except in the area of Hamburg, which was an area which Brits after Second World War controlled, and therefore they made the system a bit different and they put both units together. But generally that's how it kind of worked, where they were separate bodies. What do you think about that?
About the separate...
CID separate, uniform separate.
I mean, when I started, everybody went into uniform for at least the 2 years, and in practice for a good 4 years before you were allowed to specialise. And in my case, I then went and did an attachment to CID, and the process then was you did 6 months, you then had an interview, you passed that. If you're successful, you will then go back to uniform, and then when there's a vacancy, you will then go back in CID, go on the formal CID training and become a detective constable. In the old system, when you got promoted, you would go back in uniform as a sergeant for 12 months and then go back into CID, and there'd be this to-ing and fro-ing. And in some ways it's good because you're sharing knowledge. A detective constable, as a new sergeant on a shift, can pass on his detective skills and his knowledge to the young constables. What you are losing though is you've got a sergeant there who's probably a little bit demotivated because he wants to be in CID, whereas in more recent years we've gone down the sort of not total separate departments, if you like, but when somebody is a qualified detective, if they got promoted, they will be a detective sergeant, they will be a detective inspector, and so on and so forth. So you do have that separate career paths, and I can see benefits in both. Sharing the information is good. Having people where they don't want to be is not good because of they're not going to be motivated, and it's the old round hole square peg. I mean, my experience as a young cop, often they would get a round hole in a square peg, and the theory was if you hit it hard enough it'd go in. Whereas I think now they're looking at round hole, round pegs, and people having a more defined career path in whatever specialism. The downside of that is, if you as a young PC don't decide to go in CID because you're young and you're just having fun doing what you're doing, and then later in life, after promotion to sergeant, you decide, actually, I fancy going into CID, the route across to transfer is quite difficult and doesn't happen that often, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is basically what used to happen in the Met. In the Met, there were effectively 3 areas that you could join. No, let's be realistic. There was uniform, which everybody went into, and then you could basically specialise in uniform. So traffic patrol was a specialisation, mounted branch was a specialisation, a frogman, underwater diving unit was a specialisation, and you can do that in the Met just because of the sheer numbers. So you can have specialisations in unit, and firearms was a specialisation. So that's the uniform specialisations you could add. And then of course goes without saying what you mentioned before, what you called riot police, which you, going back in time, special patrol group. Then more recently it's it's got various other names. District support unit, TSG, tactical support group. You know, these all became things that you could be in, which meant that you were dealing with the more intensive end, let's put it that way, of policing, not just riots, but more intensive. You know, you need several officers into one place, a sergeant's controlling them, and you're going in, and that became in itself a specialisation. You can argue. So you had that sort of role. In the CID then, you basically had general duty CID, and you came into the general duty CID, generally you got maybe like 5 years, 6 years, whatever it was, to get into it. And then again, within general duty CID, there were various roles you could take on, arts and antique squad, anti-terrorist branch. But those are things that you generally went in for X amount of years, and then back into the regular CID. So that's how that worked. So the knowledge moved around the regular, murder squads in regular CID work. But CID was separate. And then, of course, in our system, you had special branch, which in itself was actually its own unit, if you will, for want of a better word, which you could join and get in. I got in within 2 years, but generally it's about 4, and you could stay all of your career in the branch. So doing that specialist type of work there in special branch, and all those were separate in a sense of you coming in and out. They then brought this thing in, this is what I'm just going to say, called interchange, where if you went into those for 12 months again, you would be brought out and say, right, you're out, show your skills and you can come back in. Then the worst thing they ever did, in my belief, is they brought in tenure. Now tenure was, you've had 7 years in any role, 5 years in any role at any police station, now you've got to move. Right? Any role, any police, you've got to move. CID, 7 years, any role, got to move. The branch managed to get itself 10 years, any role, anything, move. Right? It destroyed the Metropolitan Police. Totally destroyed, because you lost overnight massive capacity. So for me, I just see the negatives in those type of roles, those type of changes for change's sake. Now, the then Commissioner Condon said he did it to prevent corruption. But listen what he said. He actually said to prevent corruption in the CID. So why are you moving everybody else? Right.
Good point.
Because if you're a corrupt detective, you'd be a corrupt uniformed officer. It's just that the corrupt aspect might be lesser. If you go to a burglary, you can still be corrupt, at the burglary scene, right? So it didn't make any sense. My argument had always been that you should deal with the corruption, not, in other words, try to a SOP really for poor management. You're not managing it correctly, so it's a SOP for that. Yeah. So that's what. So we've touched on actually the politics of policing. Now I want to come into the gritty stuff actually of policing, and I want to basically get this feel about why people think somehow the British police are corrupt, are racist, are sexist, are homophobic, and I can go on and on and on with the icks, right? That's what we've now come to because of the media. And I say that because of the media, because in my experience, yes, I've come up against police officers. I'm a black guy, if you don't know, if you just listen to the show now. I've come up against police officers who are racist. Absolutely I have. But I've come up against, 98% of them who are not, who are regular, good people who want to do a job of work. Have I come up against people who are pissed off, excuse my language, dealing with what they perceive to be crime from particular groups in a particular area? Because of where you work, you might get a particular preponderance of a particular group in a particular area. And your perception then is that these are the people who cause crimes, right? From that particular area. So you get that, and of course they may not be the out and out racist, but they may be the ones that say, oh, these are always the ones committing crime, right? You get that, or specific types of crime. And I'll give you 2 points on that. I remember coming upstairs once. I was in uniform in my 2 years in uniform, and I'm coming up the stairs into the CID area, and because I was doing CID work. Because I've been a detective for the American before, so they utilised me in CID in my probation period. So I'm coming up the stairs, and I heard a fella, and I know who he was, and he said, I'm sick and tired of them calling us racist, he said. This guy said, I treat blacks exactly the same way as I treat white scrot.
Oh dear.
So I come up and he says, so I said, he said, you know what he said there? He said, yeah, I'm absolutely right. I treat everybody the same. I treat everybody fairly. I said, no, mate, you made that difference between white scroll, which is what the police terminology for negative people, right, and blacks, giving them the same mantle, rather than actually saying black scrolls. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
There's a word missing there.
Exactly. So that's what you get sometimes in the situation. You get people who think, oh, yeah, I'm not racist, I'm doing everything exactly the same. Now I'll show you the other end. Back in the 1970s, I wasn't in the police. When I was a youngster, my family and I moved into an area, I was born in an area where we were the only black people in the whole area. My father was a professional cricketer. He had a good standing in the community. The people whom we called our grandparents, etc., were white Lancastrian individuals who only spoke Lancashire dialect. So I grew up speaking the dialect and all that sort of business. And whom I said were my aunties and uncles were these people's children, etc. Now, the reason why I mention all of that is because one of them went into the police, one of the children of these individuals. Now, and this is how I know this story. So in 1974, I'm in the sixth form. Now, in that era, the vast majority of people at 16 left school, okay? In fact, 15, rising 16, you could leave school and you were then a man or a woman and you went into work, right? That's how it worked. So I'm in the sixth form and I had to move school to go into another school for the sixth form because we didn't have it in our area. So I go into this school and it just happened that I was playing music this one day because I was doing DJing and I saw this girl, and you know what it's like, school romance, it's a romance. I see her, she's in the fifth form, I'm in the sixth, she's great, you know, and everybody's white obviously, so I'm just saying that, everybody's white, and I see her. And her brother was my best mate, he's a good mate of mine in that school, and I didn't know it's his sister, right? So anyway, we get on, it's great. He's not got a problem with it at all. So I'm invited to their house for Christmas, okay? And when the mother sees me, and I don't know why, she'd never been told that I was black, but she seemingly hadn't. And I could see as soon as she opened the door, she nigh on fell down, right? So, great, not a problem. I've dealt with that all my life. Not a great problem. So she come in, and first thing that the kids are all, quite a few kids. Five had a pretty good job. He was a local milkman and a local farmer type guy. And so basically, the kids would come and talk to me, the younger brothers and sisters, and then one by one, the mother would call them in, and they wouldn't come and talk to me anymore. So we have this food that we're having just for our Christmas, and frankly, she said, all right, the food was finished. She put the girl at one end, and I'm at the other end, and basically, as soon as she said, right, it's time to go now. So the father drives me back home. And you know, I'm 17. Father drives me back home, and she's just 16, I think, in the fifth. Yeah, coming 16, just a year before. And so I go in, and the moment that I step in the house, taking account there's no mobile phones, no nothing like that. The phone rings, and the mother's on the phone. She says she don't want to go out with me anymore. I said, why? I said, why is that? Well, she doesn't. I said, well, put her on the phone. She said, well, she's crying. I said, well, that doesn't sound like she don't want to go out with me anymore. It sounds like you don't want her to go out with me anymore. Right. So the reason why I mention all of that is because obviously we don't take any notice of that and we keep going out with each other. And then the next minute, I'm told by who I called an uncle, policeman, he says, the parents came down today to the police station, right, and said, there's a fella in those days it was a desk sergeant, right, to the desk sergeant, to the crime sergeant indeed, in those days in Lancashire Police, and said, I want a fellow arrested, he's bothering my daughter, blah, 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 blah. And the sergeant said, now he said, I was listening, the sergeant said, what's he done then, what's the offence? So, well, he's a black fella, and basically, we don't want him seeing our daughter, and he's seeing our daughter, blah, blah, blah. And he said, if the laws are changed that a white person can't go with a black person when they're not causing any problem, I will leave this job. Right? That's the police in the 1970s. That's what that guy told me. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because in the school, what happened is the parents went to the school and the headmaster made a new law that was never before in place, that sixth formers cannot fraternise with fifth formers. Right? And he made it that it was absolute cannot happen. So now we get this, the police are always bad, the police are always wrong, but the education system were the ones that actually took some action, not the police. The education system made a law that never happened before, that fifth formers and sixth formers couldn't fraternise, right? And I know the same from the NHS, when my mother worked there because she was a nurse. She didn't get any opportunity to jump from being an SEN, right? All because of race. But we're happy to talk about the police. We never talk about other systems. So my question to you is, as an officer, two things. One, does that get on your nerves? And I've gone back to the 70s when there was no such thing as anti-racism laws, because they weren't, right? Yeah. So, you know, nobody gave a hoot about that sort of stuff. So that's the first thing. it wasn't because the guy knew me. It was only that the uncle, he was a constable, he overheard it. He didn't need to say anything, he overheard it and told me. He says, if you're having a problem, so don't worry about it. You do what you need to do, right? So the point I'm saying is that you can find good, bad, racist, non-racist, indifferent in every system. Does it not anger you that the police are singled out?
Really, definitely does so. And I think in this day and age, it's getting worse. The media are portraying things worse. Social media, and now that's constantly growing. Social media is a real big thing that fuels it. And what annoys me is, going back to the days of Robert Peel, I think he said the police should be the public and the public should be the police. So the police, quite rightly, should reflect society. So you will get the odd person who is homophobic, who is racist, who is sexist, misogynic. You're going to get that. Just like if you get a large group of joiners, electricians, accountants, lawyers, you're going to get people who have views that are not in line with what we should have. The problem is, in the police, they are singled out, and it's not, there are one or two people in the police that don't behave correctly, and maybe one or two of you is racist. If there's an incident that happens that highlights this, and it shouldn't happen, don't get me wrong, I'm not condoning it in any way, but it goes from that individual's done this to you're all the same. And we are a body of people that get tarred with the same brush all the time, and really, really unfairly. And going back to what I said about social media, is you will see a 5-second clip of a police officer pushing somebody or grabbing someone, and that gets posted on social media. Millions of people see it. The cop has been judged. So social media play judge, jury and executioner, and they are judged on that. If you then see the video that's the 1 minute or 2 minutes leading up to that, it puts things in a massively different context. But by the time the full video has gone out, that cop has already been found guilty in the eyes of the millions of people who've seen the video. So then when you move forward, I think that cop will find it so difficult to get a very fair misconduct hearing if it ever came to that. And sometimes things will lead to misconduct hearings because of public opinion and public outcry when they shouldn't do. So in answer to the question is, yes, it does annoy me. I think whenever there's wrongdoing, we should seek it out and deal with it correctly and robustly. But by the same token, we shouldn't tar everybody with the same brush and just say, you're all racist, you're all sexist, you're all heavy-handed, you're all out there to beat people up. We should deal with people on an individual basis.
I get the feel that what we find in our society, and by the way, it's not just social media. There was a programme some months ago on Panorama, which is basically the flagship political programme in the United Kingdom on the BBC. And that programme had an individual who went undercover in the police, it was called. And basically he performed the role, and you'll know this role because you were a custody officer.
Yep.
He performed the role of a civilian custody suite, what do they call them, a manager or something like that? Not managers.
In my force, they used to call them detention officers. They were there to work under the custody sergeant.
Correct. Now, this is what this guy was doing. So he'd come in, got 7 weeks training from the Met, right, to basically be this custody detention officer. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, because you know the role backwards. When you sign up to this custody role, do you not sign papers that say, I want to be a custody officer?
Well, yeah, it's part of the job application, isn't it? You are signing to say, I agree to the terms and conditions of this role, and that's what I want to do.
So if you're a custody officer, but you actually are a BBC reporter who's going to wear a secret camera throughout the whole time that you're a custody officer, have you committed some type of offence, do you think, in you actually doing that? Because the original papers you've signed, and they get basic vetting, which the vetting you spoke about. So would that not be something, would you not have lied on your application?
To me, it looks as though there's a very, very good chance that he would have had to have told some lies on that application to be successful in gaining that role.
And if you lied on your application, what happens to you?
Well, ordinarily, you'd be dismissed.
Right, so
and potentially prosecuted because there's potential criminal offences in addition to any misconduct.
Right. So that was part one of this week's Black Spy podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll have part 2 next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.